She would tell it later like a plain sentence, the kind you say when you are naming a fact and not asking for applause. I saved the mission alone. But my name was erased from the report. The words sat in the air like the weight of the coin she would not yet understand the meaning of. They did not sound like a boast. They sounded like a ledger entry in a life where most of the important things never made it onto paper. Elena Marquez had learned to carry endings in her pocket. 30 years of shifts teach you how to hold a last one without breaking it wide open, how to tuck away the small rituals and the soft goodbyes and the ache in your knees. Tonight was her final run. There was no cake. There would not be an oversized banner, no parade of co-workers. She wanted it that way. She wanted to close the door quietly, fold up the uniform, and let the city keep its small, private violences without her in the picture. She was 49, with a face like a map of years lived up close to other people's pain. The skin around her jaw had the soft looseness of someone who had smiled more to keep herself sane than to be polite. Her hands were broad and generous and scarred from a lifetime of belts, buckles, and the tiny abrasions that came from pulling someone into the seat of a squad car or anchoring a stretcher. The left thumb still had a shallow line where a needle had slipped years ago when she was 15 and decided she would never back down from what needed doing. Jared rode shotgun tonight. He was 29, all nervous energy and new tattoos, and a grin that spread like light across the cab when the radio crackled. He had the loose certainty of someone who had not yet learned how often a wrong call could look like forever. He moved fast and made jokes to keep his hands from trembling. Elena liked him. He needed someone who would not let him romanticize danger. She had been that someone for a half-dozen recruits over the years. Tonight, she was trying to be something else, just an anchor, a steady presence, a person who could make sure the end of the shift felt like a single, manageable sentence instead of a paragraph that spiraled. The ambulance looked small under the sodium glare at the end of the bay. A banner in the break room read, "Congrats, Elena." But she had not let herself really look at it. The coffee in the lounge had cooled into something bitter and brown. Her locker still had the faded sticker of the academy class, the year smudged by sweat. She palmed a photograph tucked into the pocket of her jacket, her brother grinning at a barbecue, his arm around a woman she had long since stopped trying to explain. Little acts of ordinary life, kept private, the way you save postcards no one asked for. They took the call at 2:13 a.m., a disturbance behind Blue Dock Bar, a man down in the alley, reports of a fight. The radio voice was clipped, meaning they had a CAD number and a unit on the way. Elena had done hundreds of alley calls. Most ended with bad choices lessons and someone trying to sleep it off on a stoop. Some were worse. She sat up straight anyway, an automatic brightening of the muscles you learn when other people's breathing is in your hands. "Let's keep it routine," she said to Jared, and she meant it. Routine was a kind of prayer for her, a list of things to check, to name, to document. Routine kept panic small. As they turned the corner toward Blue Dock, the city smelled like the sea and cigarette ash. Rain had been thin earlier, but had left the bricks slick, a dark wash on the ground. Neon bled from the tavern windows, red and purple, into the puddles. The alley was a spine of trash bags and rusted dumpsters. Graffiti traced the walls like nervous handwriting. A dog barked somewhere and then clattered away as they arrived. The man was at the far end of the alley, half under the yawning shadow of a delivery truck. He was slumped against the bricks, one arm cradled uselessly. Elena and Jared slid the stretcher into place with practiced silence. He was breathing, but poorly. Shallow gasps that made the hair on Elena's forearm stand up. There was a rag of fabric pressed to one side of his head. Jared's flashlight caught something glinting on the pavement, something too bright to be ordinary. Elena smelled copper, faint and metallic. "Pulse?" she asked. She did not need to, but she always asked. It made the world comprehensible. "Slow, but there," Jared said. His hands were steady as he checked. The young man was competent. Elena watched him because part teacher never truly retires. He read her face and nodded the way students do when they want a grade. She knelt. The man's face was bruised, an artist's palette of purples and black blue. A cut opened on the temple and clotted. She saw, under the blood, a smaller bruise forming where someone had hit him hard. He was swollen, lips frothing quietly. She scanned, airway clear enough, breathing supported, but he needed help and soon. She noted pupils unequal, the kind of thing that makes EMTs alter their priorities, like traffic heading around a stalled car. "GCS," Jared mouthed. 10 and falling, Elena said. She had been counting and grading for so long that acronyms carried the cold clarity of orders. 10 was a phrase that made rooms reconfigure. It meant he might be slipping away if they did not move fast. They began the ritual. Immobilize, secure, load. Elena's hands worked like the hands of a person reading Braille, translating body signs into interventions. She set the cervical collar and kept talking to the man even as she wrapped him. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked. His fingers twitched and then loosened. She read eyelids like pages. Then the world shifted. Out of the dark, 3 figures moved. They had been at the bar, later reported witnesses would say. They had, in other words, been where all human choices are made in the same room, until someone decided one more thing. Their faces were set with something sharper than drunkenness. Elena could see the carelessness in the way they walked toward the stretcher, a casual menace that had no interest in who lay on the pavement. "Hey!" one of them shouted. Words were crude, useless things when faces were clenched like fists. Then hands came out. They shoved. One of them kicked at the stretcher, and metal squealed. Elena's body remembered the library of responses stored by reflex. Hands up to deflect, a step to shield, an instinct to put herself between harm and someone who could not defend themselves. She moved without counting the cost. It was simpler that way. She had been taught to be small, to become a wedge between danger and the helpless. She planted herself like a door and waited for the storm. The first hit came across her shoulder. It didn't sound like much, a dull whap that tasted of iron, but it set off a new catalogue inside her bones. Pain in the shoulder, the sharpness that told her there was no fancy repair at home, just time and stubbornness. She tasted something metallic and hot and knew she had a split lip. She kept speaking to the patient. The attacker's movements were messy, fueled by a desire to make damage, because damage is how some people find certainty. Jared tried to back her up, swinging a flashlight to frighten them, but there was no real defense in a brick alley at 3 in the morning. One man shoved past Jared and reached for the unconscious stranger. Elena shoved back with everything she had. The contact turned into a shove that spun her on her heels. She felt the wall under her hand, brick grain pressing into her palm. Another blow found her side and knocked air from her lungs. For an instant, there was a white blossom of dizziness at the edges of her vision. She did the simplest, hardest thing an EMT can do. She kept the patient between the attackers and the ambulance. She would later describe this as muscle memory. In the moment, it was just the only practicable choice. If the man on the ground sustained another hit, his fragile airway would be lost, or bleeding would restart unchecked. There was a calculus of minutes and seconds and the human body that Elena had learned not as theory, but as prayer. A shadow of sirens moved at the periphery. Police were on the way, the dispatcher's voice would later confirm. But seconds in that alley arrived stretched and elastic. Someone shoved her to the gutter, her head cracked against a rusted pipe. For a second, she tasted dust that was older than her. Jared yanked a knee between man and ground so fast, Elena felt it like a lifeline. The attackers saw the police lights, and one of them cursed, a low sound, and they fled, melting back toward the bar like something embarrassed by the light. Elena held her breath until it hurt, then let it out slowly. Breath in, breath out. The patient did not look at her. He looked inward. He kept breathing. Jared called over the radio, the voice snapping into professional tone. They loaded the man into the ambulance with hands that felt like two sets of different-sized gloves, one steady and competent, the other younger and trembling. Elena sat on the edge of the gurney and tried to count the ways her body had failed her that night. There was pain in the shoulder that flared with each movement. A bruise blossomed along her side. Her lip bled again when she swallowed. The taste of iron had set, more insistent now. "Drive," she told Jared, and she meant it. The trip to the hospital was a jagged blur. Jared drove with clean efficiency, lights on, siren a small keening behind them. Elena monitored the technologies she knew like a second language: saturation, respirations, blood pressure. And she kept talking to the man because silence eats away at the edges of rescue. She reminded him of the simple things: her name, the night air, birds he could not hear. She braided those words into him like a cord. At County General, the trauma doors opened into white light and the smell of antiseptic. A team took the patient with an automatic choreography, a ballet of practiced hands and clipped instructions. Elena felt the tug of exhaustion as an animal's weight. Her shoulder throbbed. A nurse named Carla took one look at her face and said quietly, "You need to sit." "You'll be fine," Elena managed. She wanted to make her usual joke about not being the one who needed stitches tonight. The joke died. Carla had a look one learns to read after too many nights in an ER, an assessing kindness. She wrapped an ice pack around Elena's shoulder and propped her up. Officer Reading arrived halfway through the handoff, badge low, coat still wet at the collar. He had the slow cadence of someone used to writing truthful statements in a hurry. He asked questions. He took names. He moved like a person with the job of recording things that were already wrong. Elena answered as best she could. Timeline, location, what happened. She felt the edges of the event compress into checkboxes. "Suspects fled toward the front," Officer Reading said, his pen moving. "We'll canvass. Any witnesses?" "A couple from the bar," Jared said. "They were there. They'll speak to you." The hospital took the man from them. The words "trauma team," "CT," and possible intracranial hemorrhage moved through the air like neutral facts, taut and clinical. Elena watched them wheel him away. Her legs were rubber. The adrenaline that had steadied her earlier was fraying into a raw, exhausted thread. Medical staff patched her up in the triage room. A few stitches at the split lip, a wrap for the shoulder, a battery of questions meant to prove she was competent to go home. Dr. Hassan, young and steady, examined her with efficient kindness and put a tetanus shot in her arm, the jab landing like punctuation. Elena smiled when she could. Someone offered her a cup of coffee, so cold it might as well have been an apology. "You should get it checked out," Carla said, and Elena thought she meant the shoulder. She also thought Carla meant something larger, the way the night had landed itself on Elena's chest, the way her last shift could not be allowed to be just another file. There was a murmur in the hallway then, a sound like the world changing rooms. It was not loud. It had the quieted coordination of people who moved with a reason that cut across ordinary hospital lines. A man in plain clothes stepped into the bay, and when he looked at the patient in the CT room, his face arranged itself into a map of someone who understood the stakes of being needed. Elena watched him for a moment and then looked away, because she did not want to be the person who let curiosity outrun duty. Jared sat across from her, hands clasped, eyes on the loop of the ceiling light. He kept replaying the shove, the hit, the moment the man had gone still. He had the embarrassment of the shaken and the apology of the survivor. Elena saw him as if for the first time. She had been a mentor. Tonight, she had been a shield. She knew what the city asks of you, that you show up, that you pick up, that you hold steady. Recognition was rarely part of the bargain. A hospital clerk came by and said, in the kind of voice reserved for families and for people who must be shielded from complication, that a unit was involved and that the hospital would be coordinating with them. She used overly neutral phrasing. A military-affiliated team, she said, careful not to reveal anything she herself did not know. Elena felt the shape of the phrase like a cold hand at the back of her neck. Something was shifting, but it did not yet have a name. Jared pressed a paper cup of stale coffee into Elena's hands. You should call it a night, he said. You saved the man, Elle. Don't press it. She let the cup sit between her palms, warmth against weathered skin. She wanted to say, as she often did, that she had not thought of herself as saving anything. She had been doing her job. But the truth came out softer. Not looking for a parade. You earned at least a pizza, Jared replied. Then he looked at her and added, lower, you've earned a whole lot more. It was the sort of praise that made Elena uncomfortable. She was not modest in the sense of false humility. She simply believed that heroism was a habit, not a trophy. The city expected you to be used up and then disappear. She had lived by that expectation, even loved it in some private way. Officer Redding came back with a small, polite frown. We picked up 3 unwitnessed statements, he said. They're in holding, some cuts, some bruises. Nothing life-threatening. He wrote their names down like small proof. If you want to give a victim statement, we can schedule that. Elena shook her head. She had given a statement already in the alley, the quick version, the essential details. She felt the exhaustion like a second skin. The idea of filing paperwork felt like an insult to the night that had just been survived. She had never been someone to press her chest for medals. As the hours melted, the patient's case grew a pull. The plainclothes man had not been alone. A woman in dark clothing had moved like someone trained to carry bad news with a neutral face. Someone else with the same clipped bearing had put a hand on the corridor's wall, as if to steady himself against the tide of the hospital. Elena watched them from the doorway of the break room, nursing her shoulder with the ice pack, counting the ways one can recognize a person whose identity is less about uniform and more about the way they are needed. You did good, the woman said quietly as she passed Elena. She did not look like a stranger. Her voice had that economy people in command tend to carry. Elena inclined her head because that is what you do when another person recognizes what you have done without making a song out of it. They told her eventually that the man had been stabilized enough for a surgical consult and that the team was coordinating with outside authorities. Those words meant less to her now than the way Carla had given her the ice pack and the way Jared had sat and not let her alone with the small humiliation of being hurt on her last shift. Those concrete things were the ledger of her night. Recognition in the alley would be footnotes. Recognition in forms and on reports that was not even on her list of hoped-for things. When dawn came, the city had the pale, washed-out look of someone unwilling to be honest about what had gone on the night before. Elena should have gone home. She should have packed up and driven to the small apartment where the curtains were still the wrong length, and the plant on the windowsill looked toward a window that was not the sun. She knelt in the break room and took the photograph from her pocket and told the empty air that she was leaving. She put the photograph back into the small pocket and folded the uniform into the metal locker. But then the plainclothes man came back to the triage area and found her. "You're Elena Marquez?" he asked. It was a question that had no ceremony. "I am," she said. She felt the contour of fatigue in her voice like a rope. "I'm sorry for the trouble tonight," he said. He extended his hand, not a salute, nothing the uniform required, just a human hand. "I'm Chief Hale." The name landed in Elena's chest like a stone dropped into water. It made ripples because she knew, in the way certain facts whisper, that the man who said that carried the kind of authority that could move mountains in some places and close doors in others. He had a veteran's calm about him, the sort of quiet that is not a lack of feeling, but a conservation of it for where it mattered. "You saved one of ours," Hale said. He did not expand on it. He had the economy of people who do not need to speak long when the work is clear. Elena felt a small prick behind her eyes. It was not for accolades. It was for the sense that the night had somehow become larger than the alley, larger than the body beneath the blanket. There was a sudden, intimate understanding that she had touched something that belonged to another order of concern. The word mission hovered in her mind like a shuttered window. She did not know yet whether it would open. "Was he—" she started. "He's stable," Hale said, the syllables careful. "But he's the kind of person whose team needs him. You were the one who kept him with us." The man who was the subject of this careful language lay somewhere beyond the door. Elena could not know the face of the person she had pulled from the gutter after the adrenaline and the teeth and the rain. She had given him oxygen and reassurances and the rhythm of another person's voice. She had pressed a bandage to a temple and threaded a collar under a jaw. She had put her body between him and the men who wanted him hurt. That, Hale said, was enough. "You did good," Hale repeated. And this time there was something in his voice that did not try to mask the note of gratitude. The words were small, the weight behind them was not. Hale's presence made the hospital a different place for a few moments. Men in clean, dark jackets moved with a kind of disciplined silence. They spoke to each other in clipped phrases. Someone in a crisply folded team jacket directed nurses as if guiding a busload at a stop. There was a discreetness in the way they moved that spoke of people used to doing things without wanting the city to know their names. Officer Reading watched Hale with the polite, professional attention of someone who knows how to make room for other kinds of procedure. Hospitals are places where many worlds collide: the city, family, bureaucracy, private orders. Elena felt, in the space between the triage bed and the doors to the OR, the pushing together of two kinds of obligation. The public duty she had served for almost 3 decades, and this new private gratitude that had nothing to do with the paperwork she had been taught to respect. Hale reached into his pocket and paused, then put something on the stainless steel counter, a coin. Not a coin like the ones she kept in a tin in her drawer for parking meters. This was a challenge coin, dark, heavy, an unofficial marker of belonging handed from palm to palm, across the uncertain geography of favors and fights. It sat there on the metal with a small, honest weight. Elena did not touch it. She had seen challenge coins before, in movies and on veterans' desks, the kind of thing men displayed to speak of brotherhood. She had never been offered one. She did not know the rules for accepting it. She realized, in a suddenly childlike way, that she had not been prepared to receive this kind of intimate thanks. "Ma'am," Hale said, and he said it as if it were a small benediction. The words slid into the room and settled against Elena like something warm. Her hands trembled as she reached to pick up the coin. It was heavier than she expected. When it rested in her palm, it felt like an answer to a question she had never been taught to ask out loud. For a moment, surrounded by the bright hum of hospital machinery and the low murmur of staff, Elena understood a truth she had always held in quiet places. Recognition often arrives in private, in the tilt of a head, the press of a coin, the sober salute of a stranger who knows he is indebted. It is not always a headline. It is the brief naming of service by someone who wears different clothes for different reasons. She would later tell reporters that this was the moment that had the most meaning. A dozen men standing in formation in a place that was not a parade ground. The word ma'am, spoken so many times, it became a hymn. The coin lying in her palm like a small altar. She would say she felt for the first time a kind of official membership in a thing she had always admired from the outside. But at that instant, before words grew into narratives, and before reporters found the corners of the story, there was only the coin and the weight of a hand on her shoulder. and Hale's eyes, which were in that moment not the eyes of a commander, but the eyes of a man who had watched one of his own carried close to the edge and had been handed back by a stranger. "You saved the medic," he said finally, as if naming it would shape the space between them. Elena did not yet know the name of the medic. When she asked, Hale said quietly, "Ryan Blake." The syllable felt solid. Elena repeated it to herself as if testing its fit in her mouth. There was a softness to it that contrasted with the hard edges the night had carved into her bones. "You should go home, Elena," Hale added. "We have it from here." It was not an order exactly, but an instruction pressed through gentleness. Elena felt a complicated relief. Part of her wanted the finality, to take that coin, to tuck it into a drawer and let the city keep its mysteries. Part of her wanted to stay and watch as the work unfolded, to make sure the invisible hands stayed gentle. She chose the small mercy of leaving. She let Jared helm the paperwork. She folded herself into the thin privacy the hospital allotted to people who had been hurt while doing the work they were required to do. At the threshold, Hale's gaze met hers, and he inclined his head, the briefest of salutes. Elena felt the kind of recognition that bypasses bureaucracy and goes straight to the marrow. That night, in the ambulance bay, a formation had stood for a stranger, and a coin had been placed into her palm. She carried that small circle in her pocket as she walked to her car, as if it were a secret she had earned. The metal was warm from her skin. She palm-read it like an old friend. She did not yet know what the future would do with that small fact. When she finally went home, it was early enough that the city still smelled of rain. Her apartment was small and honest. She kept the coin in a drawer next to the postcards she never mailed. She slept with the ache in her shoulder like an old dog beside her. Morning came with the thin certainty of things that will not be changed by wishes. Elena walked into the station to hand in the night's reports and to collect the small stack of forms that was the ritual of any shift. Jared had texted her a picture of the alley with crime scene tape, a note that said, "Are you okay?" And then 3 smiley faces he thought would ease her into laughter. She did not respond right away. Paperwork is a kind of accounting that finally decides what is seen and what is not. Elena had always trusted that records were dry and boring, the place where lives became manageable lines on a page. She sat at the desk in the records office with the coin in her jacket and wrote the facts down, each sentence a small, steady act. Where the CAD number went, she tapped the pen. Names, times, witness statements. Slowly, the night made itself legible on paper. When she slid the forms to the clerk, the woman behind the glass skimmed them and, with a look Elena could not place, slid them into a file marked for forwarding. "Someone from the hospital will follow up," the clerk said. "You did good, by the way." Elena smiled, and it felt like an old thing to do. She was not looking for praise. She was just being honest with herself about what the night had been, a knot of impulse and training and muscle memory that had somehow come out the other side. She did not expect hours later to find a blank where her name ought to have been. The public log, the kind that goes out for insurance and public records, the sort of roster that gets later scraped for statistics and commendations, had a hole. Her name was not on the list of responders. The entry noted EMS on scene, but the column for the individual who had administered aid was empty or redacted or replaced with an official note that read in bureaucratic neutrality, "Responder withheld, not listed." Elena stared at the screen for a long time. The coin in her jacket felt suddenly heavier. She scrolled and tried another portal. The medical record that had been made public for internal purposes had the patient's name and the hospital team's notes. But the line where a civilian responder would be credited was blank. She tapped her fingers on the desk as if she could change the way the world insisted on naming things. She called the records clerk. She asked if it was an oversight. The clerk had a polite voice and a slow, guarded explanation. Sometimes cases involving outside agencies are redacted for privacy. Sometimes names are omitted by request of a military authority. Sometimes there are administrative errors. The clerk used the phrase indefinido, the way a person uses a shield. Nothing conclusive, no accusation, just blank spaces. Elena felt her pride knot into something narrower. Her first instinct was anger, but it was the low, polite kind that lives in people who have been trained to stomach injustice and then move on. Her second instinct was a quieter one, to find Chief Hale and ask for a name or an answer. She wanted at the very least to know whether the omission was a matter of security or a slip of paperwork. Before she could decide, she received a message from Jared. "You waiting for the follow-up?" He added a smiling emoji. She typed back, "They didn't list me." She hit send before she could think about the small humility of the act. Jared's reply came quick. "That's messed up. I'll drop by." Elena closed the computer and stood. The coin was the weight in her pocket, a small reminder that the ledger of human gratitude and the ledger of official record are sometimes different books. She could hold the coin and keep it like a private altar. That would be enough, she thought. It should be enough. She walked out of the station into another day that had not yet learned what had happened to her. There were runners, a dog walker, an older man eating a bagel on a bench. Life moved, habitual and indifferent. The missing line on the report waited in the silence like an unasked question. Elena could have let it be. She had always been careful with the energy it takes to demand a place in the files. She had always preferred the small victories no one printed. But somewhere between the coffee and the coin and the clip of Hale's salute, she felt a stubbornness not born of ego, but of truth. When you hold another person's last chances in the palm of your hands, the fact that the world refuses to name you for it feels like an extra wound. It is not about awards. It is about being seen by the systems that keep history in neat columns. She tucked the coin into her jacket, slid the photograph back into her drawer, and walked toward the ambulance bay where, that night, men in dark jackets had stood in formation. She told herself she would ask one question. Was the omission a request? An accident? She wanted the answer to be simple as a medical chart, but civil systems rarely offered such clarity. She found Jared leaning against the ambulance, staring at the dent in the side where some idiot had kicked it that morning. He looked up when she approached, and there was an instant of something like shared fatigue. "They took him," he said. "Hale said they took him. He said they'd handle it." Elena nodded. The word "they" had complicated edges, like something that had already been claimed. She thought of Hale's hand on the coin, the way his eyes had been full, not with ceremony but with gravity. She thought of the men who had fled into the night, and the way police reports reduce human chaos into bullet points. She thought of paperwork, and how it sometimes rewrites history by omission. "Let's get you home," Jared said, and his voice had a tenderness that cannot be corralled by policy. Elena felt gratitude then, simple and honest, for the younger EMT who had watched her back and then stayed to make sure she did not walk into the quiet of retirement with an unhealed bruise. She went home, but the word erasure hummed in her head like a loose wire. She did not know yet which of the many possible reasons had placed her name in the margins. She did not know whether it was an administrative error, a blank left by someone who did not think a woman in plain clothes mattered, or a deliberate redaction for reasons she would not be allowed to know. The coin in her pocket kept its small promise, that someone had seen her. Later that afternoon, before the city had quite decided whether it would remember or forget her night, Elena found herself walking back toward the hospital, because some questions demand a witness, and because the night's silence would not let her go. She had no plan beyond asking one simple thing: why did the report forget her? She did not yet know that when she opened that door, a line would be crossed. She did not yet know that private honors and public records do not always travel the same path. She did not yet know that being called ma'am by a formation of men would be both balm and beginning. The coin in her pocket was warm from her hand when she closed it, and the metal clicked against the photograph in a little private symphony. She walked alone into the hospital and into a room that now felt like a theatre where reputations were quietly made and unmade. The city kept moving outside. Inside, the scene held its breath. The hospital kept its hush like a second skin. Elena moved through it with the coin, folding against her ribs, a small private gravity. She had come for an answer that might be simple and bureaucratic, a misplaced line, a tired clerk's mistake. Instead, she found the slow mechanics of a system built to keep things measured and sometimes hidden. The records office smelled faintly of toner and menthol lozenges. A woman at a glassed-in station looked up when Elena entered. Her eyes were the practiced calm of someone who had seen grief served in forms and learned how to hand it back without flinching. "I'm looking for the incident file from last night," Elena said. Her voice did not announce itself. It slid into the room like someone laying a hand on a counter. She gave the CAD number, the time, the alley name. The clerk typed with the economy of someone who had learned that patience is work. "You were on scene?" the clerk asked, her face neutral. "Yes." Eleanor felt the words sit in her mouth like a stone. The clerk's fingers moved. The screen blinked. The clerk's eyebrow climbed a fraction, and she gave a small, non-committal frown. "There's an entry," she said, "but the responder field is blank, or it's flagged." "Flagged how?" Elena asked. She could feel the impatience building like a fever under her skin. She had been careful with her energy all her career. Now it gathered like a hard pebble. The clerk printed a page and slid it through the slot. Elena read, "EMS on scene, patient transferred to outside authority. Under responder, not listed. Attached note, responder withheld, redacted." "Elena," she said aloud, reading, because the letters made the world make one more sense. The clerk folded her hands. "Sometimes that happens when outside agencies request redaction. Sometimes it's administrative. Sometimes names are withheld for privacy or operational reasons. I don't have the clearance to say which." Elena nodded, though the nod did not fix anything. "Is there someone I can ask? A supervisor? An ombudsman?" "We can file a formal request for clarification," the clerk said, "but if it's been requested by an outside authority, it may remain redacted in the public record. You could talk to your chief or the military liaison at the hospital." The words were as carefully neutral as a bandage. They did not heal. She left the office with a printed half-answer and the feel of a question lodged behind her ribs. Outside, the day had skinned to the color of ordinary errands. People let their lives run normally around her confusion. Eleanor kept the coin in her hand as if it could weigh the world toward clarity. Officer Reading found her near the ambulance and listened like a man letting a verdict be spoken. He had the quiet competence of someone who archived trouble in neat handwriting. When she described the blank field, his jaw tightened for a moment. Not in accusation, but in recognition of a common friction between civic paperwork and other forms of authority. "I can make some calls," he said. "Check with the dispatcher, see if there's any notation, but frankly, if a military request came through, it has priority on certain things. That's how their system works sometimes." Elena didn't want the explanation to be that simple. She wanted the answer to be a clumsy human error that could be fixed with an apology and an extra line typed. But she also knew how systems protected themselves. She had been an EMT long enough to understand that institutions make choices about who appears in their histories. "Will they tell me?" she asked. Officer Reading sighed. Not a heavy sound, but the kind of breath that carries small truths. "Maybe. Maybe not. They'll tell you what they can. If it's redaction for operational security, that's their lane. If it was an omission, we can correct it. I don't want to guess." She walked then with a kind of slow resolve. There was a person behind the redaction, Ryan Blake, whose name, until Hale had said it, had been a shape without sound in her mouth. There was also the private kindness, Chief Hale's hand, the dozen salutes, the weight of the coin. None of that belonged to a file unless someone decided it should. Jared showed up at the station with a takeout box of greasy, overcooked pizza, his version of consolation. He did not have much faith in paperwork. He had the younger, healthier faith in small human gestures. "You sure you want to waste energy pushing this?" he asked, because he worried for her the way someone worries for an older sibling with more irritation than sense. "I want my night to be true," Elena said. "Not because I need a credit on a spreadsheet, but because when someone else's life depends on you, the record should say who showed up. That's how people learn who they can trust." It was not only pride, it was also a practical thing. Records mattered for follow-up, for legal clarity, for the small justice of being seen. She could smell the metaphors stacking like boxes. She could also feel the coin in her pocket, like a private answer to a public omission. The next day, she did what she had done most of her life. She showed up to the places where her questions might meet an answer. She went to County General and asked to see the liaison assigned to outside agencies. She walked the corridors that had felt like a temporary theatre the night before, and this time the scene felt less novel and more like a ledger to be balanced. Ryan Blake was awake when she saw him. The man in the hospital bed was not a heroic cipher anymore. He was a person with a bandage, with a tired contraction of the brow, with a voice that sounded small when he used it. He had the jaw of someone unaccustomed to being passive. When he saw her enter, a light came into his face that bypassed the machines. "Ma'am," he said, and the word held that same soft gravity that Hale had given it. He managed a crooked smile. "You saved me." Elena, who had given herself to routines rather than accolades, felt something come undone in her chest. His eyes were clear. She sat for a while by the bed, and they did not say much. The hospital seemed to allow small intimacies like this, gratitude that had no press conference and no hashtags. "I don't remember much," he admitted. "I remember someone talking to me. I remember a face. I remember being warm." "You kept him breathing," Hale had said. "You kept him with us." Ryan's hand closed around Elena's, a gesture that had the simplicity of prayer. "I don't have the right words, He searched for something that would fit. "You did good." They talked about inconsequential things for a little while. The world outside beds and charts was a different city. Ryan asked after Jared. He tried, clumsily, to offer to help her in a way that would not be official, because he knew what official meant. Elena demurred. She had no desire to make a hero of herself, and yet the coin sat like a witness between them. After she left the room, Hale found her in the corridor. He wore the same plain clothes, but with the same gravity. He did not offer a bureaucratic answer. Instead, he offered a civilian straightness, a man who knew what to say and what to leave unsaid. "We don't get to decide all the paperwork," he said quietly. "Sometimes names are redacted at the request of a command. Sometimes it's about privacy. Sometimes it's a clerical thing. I wish I could tell you more." "You could have put my name on something," she said simply. "A note, an acknowledgement, something." Hale lifted his chin. He understood what she meant. "I wish the same," he said. "But there are layers. Some of those layers we don't touch publicly. It's not about you or your worth. It's about procedures that—" He stopped. There was a carefulness in his mouth. "You can say that to me only so far," Elena said, not angry but weary. "I know how this works. I'm tired of not being in the book when I was the one who made the line." He folded his hands, the posture of a man who wanted to fix a broken thing but recognized limits. "I can submit an after-action note on my end, for the team. I can write you a private letter of appreciation if you want. I can make a phone call to ensure your station knows what happened, but public records, if they came from an outside request, are often sealed. I'm sorry." The apology landed soft. It did not fix the blank. It did, however, do something small and important. It acknowledged the wound. Elena accepted what he offered, a private letter, a promise to make sure the men who served with Ryan knew her name. She did not ask for more, because she had learned the cost of asking too much. She also, privately, made peace with the idea that some truths are honored in people and not on paper. A day later, she received Hale's letter. It was short, typed in the clear utilitarian font that awkwardly suits formal gratitude. He wrote that she had acted with courage to protect a team member, that her actions had preserved life, and that the unit wished to recognize her. The letter would not, he explained, be attached to any public record, but it would be kept in the team's personal files and circulated in a private distribution. Elena read the words twice. They were worth less than she had hoped in terms of public acknowledgement, and worth more in terms of personal respect. People do what they can within the lattices they are given. There is a peculiar ache that comes when one's deeds are privately praised but publicly invisible. It is like having a wound tended in a neighbor's kitchen. You are cared for, but the act is not recorded where your grandchildren might read about it years later. Elena felt both the hush of gratitude and the thinness of public absence. She sat on her porch and held the coin and the letter together and let both be small proofs. In the weeks that followed, the technicalities remained. The public log stayed redacted. The hospital's internal notes listed the involvement of an outside authority and the transfer, but where a civilian responder's name might have been, there was instead a neutral line, and often the phrase responder withheld. Elena learned to navigate the peculiar privacy that draped over the case. She let the question become a notch on her life's ledger, rather than a pursuit that would rewrite it. But omissions have a way of demanding ritual to make them bearable. One evening, word spread quietly through the station that the team who owed them a debt would be visiting the ambulance bay. It was not a press event. It was not recorded anywhere publicly. It was a private formation. The same small, brutal thing that had turned a hospital backroom into a kind of chapel. Elena did not want to be paraded. She took offense at the idea, and then, in the way people who have lived long with other people's needs do, decided she would let the men have their coin ritual, and she would accept it in the way it was offered, humbly, simply, intimately. They came at dusk. The light slanted across the lot with the kind of clarity that sometimes blesses small ceremonies. A dozen men stepped from a van with the economy of people trained to move together. They were not showy. They were sober, tidy, and direct. Chief Hale stood at their head, Petty Officer Ryan Blake walking with a cane, but with eyes bright as if some inner engine had been restarted, came up the line. They did not make a speech. There is a modesty to their language, an avoidance of words that swell. Hale nodded, and the men offered a formation that was more about presence than pomp. They laid down a wreath of small gestures, a salute, the placing of hands over hearts, the folding of a coin into Elena's palm. Each ma'am, they said, was not a public claim, but a deliberate naming. In the small plainness of the moment, their gratitude was complete. Afterward, one of the men, not Hale, not Ryan, but a quiet corporal who had watched the world too closely to be impressive, fell into the habit that only soldiers know. He told her plainly that the team never forgets who saves them. Their systems might hide names for reasons that made sense in their work. That did not mean the memories were not kept. They would carry her name in their private roles like a talisman. In that way, private gratitude became a fortress against public absence. The coin in her hand hummed with the collective memory of men who had been saved by hands that did not belong to their order. The coin was proof, small and round, of a debt that must be kept in stories. Months later, Elena sat in the quiet of her kitchen and let the document she had printed months before lie beside the coffee cup. The public entry still read like a small erasure, "Responder withheld." She had learned to live with it the way one learns to live with a scar. It marks you, but it does not tell the whole story. Her name did not appear on the public after-action report, the paper that historians and news desks would pull in a decade's time. Showed the patient's case and the team response, and a neutral line where the civilian responder might have been named. Elena had been redacted from that particular ledger for reasons that could be explained in many bureaucratic tongues. Redacted for operational security, omitted at the request of a military authority, or an administrative choice. She had letters, private acknowledgements, and a coin that warmed in her pocket. She thought about visibility in a new way. 4.